India, 2004. Part 1. The Dream Beyond the Horizon. The village of Kalyan, nestled in the heart of rural India, was like any other at first glance. Dusty roads winding through clusters of humble homes, fields stretching toward the horizon, and the rhythmic hum of everyday life echoing through the air. The vibrant chatter of children playing in the distance, the persistent calls of street vendors selling their wares, and the faint scent of incense burning in the small temple at the village's center all contributed to the pulse of life that surrounded the villagers. But within one modest, clay-walled home at the edge of this village, time seemed to stand still. Inside, there was only the sound of shallow breaths and muffled sobs, a stark contrast to the lively world outside. The room was dim, the only light coming from a flickering oil lamp set on the windowsill, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Priya lay motionless on a simple cot, her frail body cocooned in thin blankets that did little to warm her from the cool evening breeze drifting through the open window. Her once vibrant spirit had been slowly drained by the illness that now clung to her like a shadow. The village doctor had long since given up hope, and his words echoed in the minds of her parents like a never-ending nightmare. "There's nothing more we can do." Her mother, Sunita, sat beside her, her heart aching with a sorrow too deep for words. She was a woman who had faced hardship all her life, droughts that had ruined their crops, debts that seemed insurmountable, but nothing had broken her like this. Sunita had always been the pillar of the family, her resolve unshakable, but now she found herself crumbling under the weight of watching her only child slip away. Tears streamed down her face as she gently dabbed a cloth against Priya's forehead, hoping to bring some relief to the fever that refused to break. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, yet she couldn't bring herself to leave her daughter's side. Every time Priya stirred, Sunita held her breath, praying silently for a miracle. Across the room, Ramesh, Priya's father, sat in silence, his back hunched under the weight of his own helplessness. He had always been a man of action, a provider, someone who could solve any problem with hard work and determination. But this was beyond him. His strong hands, once capable of tilling the land, of building and fixing anything, now felt useless. He had tried everything, every healer, every prayer, every desperate remedy, but none had worked. And now, his pride, once a shield he wore against the world, lay shattered at his feet. He looked at his daughter, her chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths, and felt a pain so deep it threatened to consume him. How could life be so cruel? How could a child, so full of life, be reduced to this? Ramesh had no answers, only the heavy, suffocating silence that filled the room. Yet in the midst of their despair, something in Priya was awakening. As her body grew weaker, her heart and soul seemed to stir with a strength that defied her illness. In her darkest moments, when the pain was most unbearable, she found solace in prayer. And not just the murmured prayers of her parents, but deep, personal conversations with the divine. While Sunita and Ramesh prayed for healing, Priya prayed for peace. It was during one of these prayers, as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, that something extraordinary happened. Priya's eyes fluttered closed, not in sleep, but in a state of deep tranquility. She was no longer aware of the soft murmur of her mother's voice or the distant clanging of the temple bell. Instead, she felt herself being drawn into a place of warmth and light, far removed from the pain of her body. In this dreamlike state, Priya found herself standing in a field unlike anything she had ever seen. The ground was carpeted in delicate white flowers that shimmered in the light of an unseen sun. Their petals swayed gently in a breeze that carried the scent of jasmine, sweet and soothing. The sky above was vast, a canvas of soft, glowing colors that merged into one another in shades of pink, gold, and pale blue. It was a place of pure serenity, where the burdens of the world seemed to melt away. As she stood there, Marveling at the beauty around her, Priya became aware of a figure in the distance. A man, dressed in flowing white robes, was walking toward her, his steps light and graceful, as if he were part of the very air itself. His face was serene, his features gentle yet strong, and his eyes were filled with an unfathomable kindness that made Priya's heart leap with recognition, though she had never seen him before. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his presence calming yet commanding. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with a sense of understanding, as if he had been waiting for her all along. "Priya," he spoke, his voice like a soft melody carried on the wind. "You are not alone." The words wrapped around her like a warm embrace, and for the first time in weeks, Priya felt a sense of peace. She wanted to ask who he was, where she was, but before she could speak, the man continued. "God has a request for you," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "A final wish, one that only you can fulfill." Priya's heart pounded in her chest. "But I'm just a child," she whispered, her voice small and uncertain. "I'm sick. I don't have the strength." The man knelt down to her level, his expression softening. "Your body may be weak, but your spirit is strong. Stronger than you know. There is something more important than your illness, Priya. Your family. They are divided, torn apart by anger and pain. God is asking you to heal them, to bring them back together." Tears welled up in Priya's eyes. She knew what he was talking about. Her family, once close, had been fractured by old wounds. Her father and uncle had not spoken in years, their relationship severed by an argument over land. Her mother's sister, Meena, had left the village after a bitter dispute with Sunita, and they hadn't seen or heard from her in a long time. The disease that now gripped Priya's body had only deepened the rifts, each family member retreating into their own pain. "How?" Priya asked, her voice trembling. "How can I do that?" The man smiled, placing his hand gently over her heart. "You already know how. Your words have the power to heal. You must believe in that power, Priya. Your family needs you." Priya's mind raced, a mixture of fear and hope battling within her. The task seemed impossible. How could she, a dying child, bring together a family broken by years of resentment and bitterness? But as she stood there, in the presence of this divine messenger, she felt a deep sense of purpose take root in her soul. "I will try," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. The man's smile grew, and he rose to his feet. "That is all that is asked of you." And with that, the dream began to fade. The shimmering field, the sweet-smelling flowers, the gentle breeze, all began to dissolve, leaving only the man's final words lingering in the air like a whispered promise. When Priya's eyes opened again, she was back in her small room, the dim light of the oil lamp flickering in the corner. Her body ached. Her head was heavy, but there was something new within her, an unshakable resolve. She glanced at her mother, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, her face still streaked with tears. Across the room, her father sat slumped in his chair, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. Priya knew what she had to do. In that moment, despite the weakness of her body, she felt a strength that transcended her illness. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had been given a mission, one that was far more important than her own suffering. She wasn't just a sick child lying in a bed. She was the bridge between the broken hearts of her family, the key to their healing. And with that realization, the first spark of hope ignited within her, a hope that would soon spread like wildfire, touching the lives of everyone around her. Part 2. Threads of the Broken Heart. The early afternoon sun filtered through the small window of Priya's modest home, casting long beams of light across the worn wooden floor. Outside, life in the village continued as usual. The clatter of pots, the distant laughter of children, and the calls of street vendors peddling their goods in the midday heat. Yet, inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with tension and grief. The air itself seemed heavy, as if weighed down by the silent suffering that had filled every corner of their once vibrant home. At the center of this stillness sat Priya, her small frame propped up by pillows in the family's dining area. The table, a relic from her grandparents' time, was made of thick wood, scarred by years of use, its surface polished by countless meals shared and stories told. Today, however, there were no stories, no laughter, only the quiet clink of utensils as Sunita placed a modest meal in front of her daughter, her face etched with lines of worry and fatigue. Priya's hands trembled as she reached for the cup of water, her once lively energy drained by the illness. She sipped slowly, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the familiar, yet fractured world around her. Her mother hovered nearby, fussing over the food, though Priya knew she wasn't truly hungry. Sunita's movements were mechanical, an attempt to keep her hands busy, as if by doing so, she could ward off the overwhelming despair that gnawed at her heart. Ramesh, Priya's father, sat across from her at the table, silent and withdrawn. His shoulders, once broad and strong from years of working the land, now sagged with the weight of his guilt and helplessness. He had barely spoken in days, retreating into a shell of quiet anguish. His eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights, stared down at the untouched plate before him, his mind elsewhere. Priya knew that the silence wasn't just about her illness. It was deeper than that, a silence that had been growing for years, festering like an open wound that no one dared to address. The illness had merely brought it to the surface, forcing the family to confront the cracks in their foundation. With a quiet resolve, Priya cleared her throat. Her voice, though weak, broke the heavy quiet that hung between them. "Papa, we need to talk." Ramesh blinked, lifting his head to meet his daughter's gaze. For a moment, his stoic mask faltered, and the raw pain in his eyes was undeniable. But he quickly looked away, unwilling or unable to meet the intensity of her stare. "What about, Beta?" he muttered, his voice rough and weary. "Uncle Raj," Priya whispered, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. At the mention of his brother's name, Ramesh's entire demeanor shifted. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched on the table, and the atmosphere, already tense, became almost unbearable. Sunita, sensing the storm that was brewing, paused in the kitchen doorway, her breath catching in her throat. She, too, had long since given up hope that the rift between Ramesh and Raj would ever heal. "I don't want to talk about him," Ramesh muttered, his voice low and hard. "But we have to," Priya insisted, her voice soft but determined. She wasn't a child anymore. Not in this moment. "You haven't spoken to him in years. Neither has Aunt Meena. Our family, it's broken." Ramesh's eyes flicked up, the anger flashing in them momentarily before being replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. He slammed his fist on the table, not out of rage, but out of the helplessness that had been gnawing at him for so long. The force of it made the dishes rattle, and Priya flinched slightly, but she didn't back down. "You don't understand, Priya," he growled, his voice trembling with emotion. "Your uncle and I, there are things we cannot forgive." "And what about me?" Priya's voice, though weak, cut through his protest. She wasn't yelling. Her words were barely above a whisper, but they carried a weight far greater than her years. "What about us?" Sunita, who had been standing frozen in the doorway, stepped forward then, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She placed a gentle hand on her husband's shoulder, her touch a silent plea for him to listen. "Priya's right," she said softly, her voice quivering with the pain of years of unspoken grievances. "Our family has been broken for too long." Ramesh sat back in his chair, his anger deflating into exhaustion. He ran a hand over his face, the roughness of his calloused fingers scratching against his unshaven skin. He had fought with his brother, Raj, over a piece of land, something that seemed so insignificant now, in the shadow of Priya's illness. Yet, that argument had escalated into a full-blown estrangement, with neither brother willing to swallow their pride. And then there was Meena, Sunita's sister, who had walked out of their lives after a misunderstanding over their parents' will. Years of unresolved bitterness had hardened their hearts, and now, with Priya's condition worsening, the weight of those decisions felt unbearable. Priya's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, her resolve unshaken. "Papa, I don't want to leave this world with our family in pieces." I want to see us together, just once. Please." Her words landed like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in years, Ramesh felt the full weight of his decisions. His pride, which had always been a shield against admitting his mistakes, now felt like a prison he had built around himself. And the thought of his daughter leaving this world without the peace she so desperately sought was unbearable. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly, his voice cracking. Priya smiled faintly, her tired eyes lighting up with a glimmer of hope. "We need to go see Uncle Raj. We need to bring him home." Priya's quiet command was like a spark in the darkness, a tiny flicker of light in the overwhelming shadow that had loomed over their family for years. Sunita's heart swelled with both fear and hope. She knew how much this rift had hurt her husband, how deeply the wounds ran. But she also saw the truth in Priya's words. Their family could not survive like this, not with the shadow of death hanging over them. Ramesh remained silent for what felt like an eternity. His face, etched with lines of weariness and regret, gave little away. The battle inside him raged, between the pride he had held on to for so long and the love he had for his daughter. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally he exhaled a long, shaky breath. "I'll do it," he said, barely above a whisper. His voice was hoarse, as if the words themselves had been dragged out from the deepest parts of his soul. "I'll go." Sunita's hand tightened on his shoulder, and she nodded silently, her own eyes glistening with tears. She had prayed for this moment for years, but never imagined it would come through their daughter's fragile voice. Ramesh stood slowly, his limbs heavy with the weight of the decision he had just made. He knew that going to see Raj wasn't just about swallowing his pride. It was about admitting the pain he had carried for years, the mistakes he had made. And now, with Priya's quiet insistence, there was no turning back. Priya watched him with tired eyes, but there was a faint smile on her lips. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered. "That's all I wanted." As Ramesh left the house, the sun high in the sky, the weight of the years lifted from his shoulders, if only for a moment. His steps were slow and hesitant, but each one carried him closer to a reckoning he had avoided for far too long. Part 3. Crossing the River of Pride. The road to Raj's farm was one Ramesh had walked countless times in his youth. As children, they had often raced along this dirt path, their feet kicking up dust as they laughed and played beneath the scorching Indian sun. But those carefree days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, with every step Ramesh took, the weight of years of silence, anger, and stubborn pride seemed to press down on him. The sky was a pale orange, the sun hanging low, casting long shadows over the dusty road. The heat of the day had begun to fade, replaced by the cool breath of an approaching evening. Ramesh's heart pounded in his chest as he neared the familiar gates of Raj's farm. He hadn't set foot on this land in more than a decade. The trees that lined the entrance were taller now, their branches swaying gently in the wind, but they were still the same ones they had climbed as boys. The memories flooded back, memories of laughter, of brotherhood, of a bond so strong that no one had ever imagined it could break. And yet, it had. The argument that had torn them apart seemed so insignificant now, so small in the face of the overwhelming reality of Priya's illness. A piece of land, something that neither brother even cared about anymore, had been the catalyst for years of bitterness. Ramesh could still remember the day they had exchanged those harsh words, words that had been laced with venom, fueled by pride. He had told himself he would never speak to Raj again, and for years he hadn't. But now, as he stood at the entrance to his brother's farm, all of that seemed like a distant echo. Priya's words, her quiet plea for peace, had pierced through the walls he had built around himself. She had given him the strength to be here now, even as every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn back. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs as he pushed open the gate with a creak. The farm stretched out before him, fields of wheat swaying gently in the breeze, the sound of cows lowing in the distance. It was a peaceful place, a place that had once felt like home, but now it felt foreign, like stepping into a forgotten chapter of his life. As he walked down the dirt path toward the farmhouse, Ramesh's hands trembled slightly. What would Raj say? Would he even be welcomed here? A part of him feared his brother's rejection, feared that the years of separation had built a wall too high for either of them to climb. But another part of him, the part that had been touched by Priya's faith, believed that there was still hope. He reached the farmhouse, his heart hammering in his chest. The wooden door, faded and worn from years of use, stood before him like a barrier to the past. He raised his hand to knock, hesitated for a moment, then forced himself to knock 3 times, the sound echoing through the quiet evening air. There was a long pause. Ramesh could hear the distant murmur of voices inside, the clatter of dishes being moved around. His breath hitched in his throat as the door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Raj. The years had changed him. His face was older, more weathered, lines of age and fatigue etched into his skin. His once thick hair had thinned, streaks of gray now visible in his beard. But his eyes, those same eyes Ramesh had looked into countless times as a child, still held the same intensity. For a long moment, the two brothers simply stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like a cloud. Ramesh, Raj's voice was low, rough from years of disuse between them. Ramesh swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He had rehearsed what he would say 100 times on the walk over, but now, standing face to face with his brother, the words seemed to vanish. Raj, he began, his voice hoarse. I'm here because of Priya. At the mention of his niece, Raj's expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing slightly. He hadn't seen Priya in years, but he had heard about her illness through whispers in the village. The news had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He had wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of support, but the years of silence between him and Ramesh had kept him away. How is she? Raj asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ramesh lowered his gaze, his hands clenching at his sides. She's not well. The doctors don't think she has much time. A heavy silence fell between them, the weight of those words settling into the air like a stone sinking in water. Raj stepped back, opening the door wider in a silent invitation for Ramesh to come inside. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Ramesh stepped through the threshold, his eyes scanning the familiar interior of the farmhouse. It was just as he remembered, simple, practical, with the scent of fresh curry lingering in the air. Memories of their shared childhood flashed before him. Nights spent around the fire, their parents telling stories of the old days, the laughter that had once filled these walls. And now, it was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Raj gestured toward the small dining table, where 2 cups of chai sat steaming, untouched. Ramesh sat down, his body stiff with the awkwardness of this unexpected reunion. Raj joined him, sitting across the table, his hands wrapped around the warm cup, though he didn't drink. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't just the absence of words. It was the presence of years of pain, of unresolved anger, of a brotherhood that had been broken. Finally, Ramesh spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong, Raj. About everything. Raj's eyes flickered with surprise, but he said nothing, waiting for Ramesh to continue. I've held on to my pride for so long, Ramesh continued, his voice trembling slightly. I thought I was justified, that I was protecting myself. But Priya, she made me realize that none of it matters anymore. She's dying, Raj. And her last wish is for us to be a family again. The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, waiting to be either grasped or severed. Raj's grip tightened around his cup, his eyes clouded with emotion. He had thought about this moment so many times over the years. What he would say, how he would react if Ramesh ever came to him. But now, sitting here with his brother, all of that seemed irrelevant. I never wanted things to be like this, Raj said quietly, his voice thick with regret. I was angry, yes, but I never wanted to lose you. The words pierced through Ramesh's defenses, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions. The bitterness, the anger, the stubborn pride that had kept him away, it all melted away, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. "I'm sorry," Ramesh whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything." Raj's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence that followed wasn't the painful, heavy silence of before. It was a silence filled with the possibility of healing, of reconciliation. Slowly, Raj reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on top of Ramesh's. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had lost. Ramesh looked up, his eyes meeting Raj's, and in that moment, the years of pain and resentment seemed to fade into the background. They weren't two broken men anymore. They were brothers, bound by something deeper than their pride, something that Priya had helped them see. "We have to do this for her," Ramesh said softly. "For Priya?" Raj nodded, his voice too thick with emotion to respond. But the look in his eyes said everything. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to mend what had been broken. And now, with Priya's illness as the catalyst, they had been given that chance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in a warm, golden glow, the two brothers sat together in the quiet of the evening, the silence between them no longer a barrier, but a bridge. For the first time in years, they were on the path to healing. Part 4. The Circle of Souls Reunited. The orange glow of the setting sun filtered through the thin curtains of Priya's small bedroom, casting a warm light on the room that had been filled with so much sorrow and uncertainty. Outside, the village hummed with its usual rhythm, but within the walls of Priya's home, time seemed to be moving slowly, as if the universe itself held its breath. Inside the room, the atmosphere was different now. It was no longer heavy with silence and unresolved pain. There was a new presence, a sense of quiet hope, and it all centered around the small, frail figure of Priya. Though her body had grown weaker by the day, there was a peace in her eyes, a serenity that none of the adults in the room could fully understand. Priya lay propped up on a mound of pillows, her delicate frame hidden beneath a vibrant patchwork quilt that her mother had made years ago. Her skin, pale and thin, seemed almost translucent under the golden light, but her eyes, her dark, soulful eyes, were alive with purpose. She gazed around the room, taking in the faces of the family members who had gathered at her bedside. Sunita sat on one side of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes, still red and swollen from endless tears, were now filled with a cautious hope. She hadn't seen her sister Meena in nearly 5 years, but now, Meena stood across from her, their eyes meeting with a silent understanding that needed no words. The years of bitterness between them seemed to have evaporated in the face of Priya's quiet strength. Ramesh stood at the foot of the bed, his arm resting on Raj's shoulder. The two brothers, who had been estranged for so long, now stood side by side, their presence a testament to the power of reconciliation. Ramesh's eyes were focused on his daughter, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and deep sorrow. He had never thought he would see this day, a day when his family, once shattered, would be together again. But it wasn't just their presence that had filled the room with a sense of unity. It was Priya's quiet yet powerful plea that had brought them all together. Her illness, which had once seemed like a curse, had become the catalyst for something far greater than any of them had anticipated. Raj's voice broke the silence, his tone soft and uncertain as he addressed the room. "It's been too long," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We let so much time pass, over things that never really mattered." Meena nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She glanced at her sister Sunita, her heart filled with regret for the years they had lost. "I thought I had all the time in the world to make things right," Meena whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "But seeing Priya like this, I realize now how wrong I was." Sunita reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it found Meena's. Their fingers intertwined, and for the first time in years, the sisters looked at each other not with bitterness, but with love and a shared understanding of the pain they had both endured. "It's not too late," Sunita said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can still heal, together. As the family stood around the bed, Priya smiled faintly. Though her body was frail and her energy was waning, her spirit burned brightly, and her small act of bringing them together filled her with a sense of peace she had never known. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes closed for a moment as if gathering strength for what she was about to say next. "I prayed for this. I prayed for all of you to be here together." Ramesh's throat tightened with emotion as he moved closer to his daughter's bedside, his voice shaking as he spoke. "You've done more than any of us could have imagined, Priya. You've given us back something we thought was lost forever." Raj nodded, his hand still resting on his brother's shoulder. "You brought us home." In that moment, the room fell into a profound silence. The sound of the wind outside rustling through the trees, the distant calls of the evening birds, it all seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet heartbeat of a family reunited. The tension that had once filled the air had dissolved, replaced by a deep, unspoken understanding that something greater than all of them was at work. Priya opened her eyes once more, her gaze sweeping across the faces of those she loved most. Though her body was weak, her spirit seemed to glow with an inner light. She had accomplished what she had set out to do. Her final wish, her last prayer, had been fulfilled. "I can rest now," she whispered, her voice filled with peace. A tear slipped down Sunita's cheek as she leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Rest, my sweet girl. We're all here." As the evening sun cast its final rays over the village, the family, once broken and scattered, stood together, hand in hand, around Priya's bed. The circle that had been fractured for so long was now whole, bound together by love, forgiveness, and the quiet faith of a little girl who had never given up hope. In the fading light of the room, there was no bitterness, no anger, no resentment, only love. And for the first time in years, the family prayed together, their voices rising in unison as they offered their thanks for the gift Priya had given them. They prayed not just for her, but for each other, for the bonds that had been healed, and for the future they would now face together. It was a moment of pure grace, a moment that transcended the pain and suffering they had endured. And though none of them knew what the future held, they knew that whatever came, they would face it as a family, united, whole, and at peace. Part 5. The Eternal Gift of Faith. 1 year had passed since Priya had brought her family back together, and though her small body no longer walked the earth, her presence was still felt deeply in every corner of the village. The transformation her final wish had ignited within her family had spread far beyond the walls of their modest home. Her story, once a quiet tale of suffering and reconciliation, had become a beacon of hope, not just for her family, but for the entire village. It was a warm afternoon, and the village square buzzed with life. The vendors called out from their stalls, selling bright fabrics and fresh fruits. Children laughed as they chased one another through the streets, their bare feet kicking up dust, while the elders gathered beneath the large banyan tree, exchanging stories of days long past. The village was alive, vibrant in a way it hadn't been in years, and at the heart of it all was the memory of a little girl who had changed everything. At the center of the square, there stood a small, newly erected stone memorial. It was simple, yet elegant, with Priya's name etched into the cool marble surface. Below her name were the words she had spoken in her final days, words that had become a mantra for those who knew her. There is always time to heal, always time to forgive. Fresh flowers were placed at its base each day, offerings from villagers who had been touched by her story, a symbol of the lasting impact she had left behind. Ramesh stood before the memorial, his hands resting gently on the cool stone, his heart full as he gazed at the inscription. A year had passed, but the memory of Priya's final days was as vivid in his mind as if it had happened yesterday. He had been a broken man before, weighed down by pride, anger, and the burdens of the past. But Priya's wish, her last prayer, had opened his eyes to the possibility of change, of redemption. And now, standing here, he was a different man. Sunita approached him quietly, her soft footsteps barely audible on the packed earth. Her face, once worn with grief, now bore the serene expression of a woman who had found peace. She stood beside her husband, slipping her hand into his, and together they stared at the memorial in silence, their hearts united in their love for the daughter who had brought them back from the brink of despair. "She would be proud of us," Sunita whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Of what we've become, because of her." Ramesh nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The journey they had been on, the healing, the forgiveness, had been long and difficult, but it had brought them closer than ever before. Priya's memory had not only healed their family, but had mended the bonds with Raj and Meena as well. The rift that had once seemed so wide, so unbridgeable, was now nothing more than a distant memory. As they stood there, Raj and Meena approached from the other side of the square. Meena held a small bouquet of jasmine flowers, Priya's favorite, which she gently placed at the foot of the memorial. Her eyes glistened with tears, but there was no sadness in them, only gratitude and love. "She gave us all a second chance," Meena said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "I never thought I would see the day when we could all be together like this." Raj, who had once been the most stubborn of all, smiled warmly. He placed a hand on Ramesh's shoulder, his voice filled with sincerity. "We owe her everything." The four of them stood in silence, the weight of what they had lost mingling with the gratitude for what they had found again. Though Priya was no longer with them in body, her spirit was ever present, woven into the fabric of their lives. She had given them the greatest gift imaginable, not just the healing of old wounds, but the strength to move forward as a family, united by love and faith. The village square, once a place of passing strangers and fragmented lives, had become a symbol of unity. And in the evenings, when the day's heat gave way to the cool embrace of night, the villagers would gather near the banyan tree, sharing stories of how Priya's faith had inspired them. Some spoke of how her simple words had mended family rifts, others of how her unyielding belief in forgiveness had opened their hearts to reconciliation. But it wasn't just within the village that her story lived on. Word had spread to neighboring towns, and soon, Priya's story was told in distant places, carried by travelers and traders. The tale of a sick child who had healed more than just her body, who had healed the hearts of her family and community, became a symbol of hope. Her family, now united, continued the legacy she had started. They became known in the village not just for their resilience, but for their kindness. Ramesh, once a man of few words and many grudges, was now the first to extend a hand of friendship to those in need. Sunita, who had once been a quiet, weary woman, was now seen offering comfort to anyone in the village who was suffering. Meena and Raj, too, had changed, their lives transformed by the miracle they had witnessed. Together, they worked to ensure that Priya's story was never forgotten. One day, as the year of Priya's passing was being commemorated, a special service was held in the village temple. People from all walks of life gathered to honor the memory of the little girl who had brought them all together. The temple, usually a place of quiet prayer, was filled with the sound of hymns, the voices of the villagers rising together in harmony. As the service came to an end, Ramesh stood before the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke. "Priya taught us all a lesson we will never forget," he began, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. "She showed us that no matter how broken we may be, no matter how deep the wounds, there is always a chance for healing. There is always time to forgive." He paused, his heart full of emotion as he continued. "We may not be able to bring her back, but we can honor her by living the way she taught us, by choosing love over anger, forgiveness over pride. That is her eternal gift to us." As he spoke, the crowd remained silent, their hearts heavy with the weight of his words. And in that moment, it was as if Priya's spirit filled the room, her presence wrapping around them all, reminding them of the power of faith, the strength of family, and the possibility of healing. And though Priya had left the world far too soon, her legacy was eternal. The seeds of love and forgiveness she had planted in the hearts of her family and community would continue to grow, spreading like the jasmine flowers that now bloomed in her memory. For the rest of their days, Priya's family lived in the light of her faith. carrying with them the lessons she had taught through her actions, her prayers, and her unwavering belief in the power of love. They lived not just for themselves, but for her, for the little girl who had shown them that the greatest miracles often come not in the form of healing the body, but in healing the heart. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.